This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here is the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And good day, I suppose I should say, rather than good afternoon. I am, in fact, the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle. I will be speaking momentarily with Robert Powell, learning a little bit about what he's doing and what his latest book is about, which I have a copy of, and have a question for him about it, but we'll get into that later. I just wanted to say a couple of things before I get to Robert. I have been trying to get back into the rhythm with my blog and posting more regularly on that than I have in the last 18 months to 2 years. Most of those issues are pretty much resolved at this point. So I'll do the best I can. I've been looking at an awful lot of the stuff that's coming out of various government agencies and responses to that, like the Arrow nonsense, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick with his latest report. I was going to say a 64-page report that said there's really nothing to UFOs, but I'm not surprised by him saying that. And Robert had said something, I think in his book, talking about the use of the UAP as opposed to UFO, trying to kind of change the paradigm or change the discussion about it into something of a more scientific nature. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Anyway, Robert Powell, according to the notes I have, was born in La Rochelle, France in 1953 and moved to the US when he was 3 years old. He has a BS in chemistry and is a former collegiate debater. I'm going to say collegiate. That was my sister's word for collegiate. He has 28 years of experience in engineering management in semiconductor industry. He helped the advanced micro devices develop its first flash memory technology that is used in today's flash cards for cameras, PCs, video cameras, and other products. His experience includes managing a state-of-the-art chemistry laboratory and managing a research and development group that worked on nanotechnology using atomic force microscopes, near-field optical microscopy, and other techniques. Yeah, I have no idea what that means. Robert is also a co-holder of 4 patents relating to nanotechnology. He has been the director of research for the Mutual UFO Network since 2007 and is also the head of MUFON Science Review Board. He is also a member of the Society for Scientific Exploration. The UFO Data Project, is an executive board member for the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies and the National Space Society. He enjoys researching, writing, making presentations related to the UFO phenomena. He co-authored reports on the Stephenville Lights and UAP 2013 Aguadilla, Puerto Rico events. His latest book is UFOs, A Scientist Explains What We Know and Don't Know. And he currently resides in Austin, Texas. And the whole point of talking to you today is to really get to know a little bit more about his book. Stephen, welcome to Robert, welcome to A Different Perspective. Boy, I'm just all over the place here.
Hi, Kevin. You're probably thinking of Stephen in Stephenville.
Yes, that's exactly what I was doing. So there. First of all, explain a little bit about the SCU, because I'm sure many of the listeners don't have a clear understanding of what that is.
Oh, okay, yeah. So the SCU stands for the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. It was formed in the fall of 2017 by myself and a few other individuals. Today, the organization has a little bit over 300 members. Almost 30% of our members are PhDs. Over half have either a PhD or a master's degree. Most have science-based degrees. And SCU's mission is the scientific examination of the UAP issue or phenomenon. SCU also holds conferences annually. And this, the one for this year, comes up May 31st to June 2nd. And people can read about it at explorescu.org. And the conference will be a physical conference in Huntsville, Alabama, and it will also be a virtual conference that you can see via Zoom and a software package called Huva.
Do you take UAP reports?
Actually, we do take some. We don't aggressively go out to try to, get people to just bring in, but we do get probably, I don't know, 6 reports a week, something like that. So not a lot. And most of those, are usually something that we can't really investigate because there's not enough data, or, it's not a real strong case. But every once in a while, we do get an interesting case that comes in.
That comment about being not getting sufficient information, sufficient data, seems to go back to Project Blue Book, where they had an awful lot of their cases marked insufficient data for scientific analysis. So the question would obviously be, what sort of data are you missing on these reports that make them difficult to investigate?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, I'll make a comment on Project Blue Book. I think a significant number of times they did not have sufficient data because they did not go out and investigate and look for that data. They just closed the case. So then you look at it 10, 20 years down the road and you're saying, okay, well, there's not enough data here, but they could have gotten the data. But what we look for is like multiple witnesses and good quality witness, right? If we have a case that has multiple witnesses, especially over an extended period of time, right? So rather than 12 witnesses that see something for 5 seconds at XY location, you've got, 4 that see it at 6 o'clock, another 5 that saw it at 6:30, another 5, that is a stronger case. And we also look for video data, photographs, any type of physical information that helps support what the witnesses state.
Well, I'm going to make a comment on Project Blue Book because I've done an awful lot of research in there. And I believe that the insufficient data for scientific analysis was a category where they could dump stuff so that it didn't end up in the horrible unidentified category. And one of the cases I looked at, I think it was actually in Austin, Texas, as a matter of fact, at the very end of Blue Book, where the witness was interviewed by an Air Force officer. They filled out that ludicrous form the Air Force had created, and it was labeled as insufficient data for scientific analysis. And the guy wrote in and said, "What more information did you need? We had the very detailed report that the lieutenant had made. We filled out your form. We gave you all the information." They eventually labeled as unidentified. So what that tells me, it confirms what you're saying there. They didn't really try very hard. And if they got a case they thought was strange, could lead somewhere, they often dumped it into insufficient data for scientific analysis. So rather than having, we worked out when I went through the Project Blue Book files to some nearly 5,000 cases that were unidentified, it reduced it to 703 cases that were unidentified. So that was kind of my experiences looking at the Blue Book cases.
Yeah. What I noticed is often they didn't, for example, go try to get ground radar to verify what their witness said. It didn't seem like there was much after the fact investigation.
The other thing, Hector Quintanilla conducted an awful lot of his investigations over the telephone. When he would have had the resources to go to the site. And I think that investigating it at the site is almost critical to understand exactly what happened there. I investigated a case here in Iowa at Palisades Kepler State Park, and the witnesses talked about these lights coming down and seeing all these lights, and eventually the females ended up drawing a disc-shaped object with occupants seen in the dome of the disc. I went out there and I knew immediately what they'd seen. They'd seen the landing lights of airplanes. They just didn't recognize what they were, and the wind was blowing the wrong direction, so they didn't hear the sound, and it was probably mostly private planes because the Air Force, the last commercial flight had been landed there like 30 minutes earlier. So I think it's critical that you go to the site and take a look around, because that may provide us an explanation for you.
I agree 100%. Going on site, a very common thing is someone says an object was extremely large, right? And if you go on site and you say, okay, could you show me out in the sky about how much area of the sky did this take up? And as you have them relive the instance, sometimes it becomes clear that this object that they explained was very large was actually quite small in the sky in terms of the amount of sky it takes up.
So they were projecting a size on it based on, I guess, their internal perceptions, as opposed to good measurements. But it also, in that kind of circumstance, if it's up in the sky, it's very hard to judge distances and heights and speed as well.
Right. It's very difficult to judge height, distance, and size, but you can judge angular size of an object. But one of my favorite questions is, to most witnesses, is how, if you saw the full moon, what, if you extended your hand out, what would it take to block the full moon? Your fist, your thumb, your little finger, what would be required? And most people think it's your fist or your thumb, but actually your little fingernail if your arm is extended out, will block the full moon.
Yeah, I've run into an awful lot of that sort of thing too. I try not to look at sightings that are less than a minute. I don't think you can get a good look at an object or get a good feel for what you're seeing if you've seen it for a matter of seconds. So I think, as you mentioned earlier, the timing is kind of important and that sort of thing. I'm going to take a break here because I'm coming up on the break time. And when we come back, we'll talk about your book and what influenced you to write that book. For those who are interested, there's a lot of data about UFOs from my perspective at my blog, which is cleverly called A Different Perspective. And you can see that at kevinrandle.blogspot.com. I just put up an analysis of the possible crashes that David Grush would be referring to in his congressional testimony, what I know about the circumstances and UFO crashes and things like that. So it's a speculative piece about what he might have been looking back. So anyway, we'll be back with Robert Powell, not Stephen Powell, Robert Powell, in just a moment. So please stick around. And we are back, as I say, unnecessarily, because you can obviously see that. The book is UFOs, A Scientist Explains What We Know and Don't Know, and it's obviously about UFOs. I'm interested in the reason you wanted to write this book and how it differs from the literally thousands of other UFO books that have been published in the past 70 years.
So maybe the difference in this is I wrote the book because I wanted to give to the public the 17 years I've spent on the UFO subject. And those 17 years amounted to almost, I would estimate, 20 hours a week, Kevin. I was able to retire early in 2006, and this is what I've done just constantly. And I wrote it so that it was readable to the average person who was not steeped in the UFO subject, right? So someone who wasn't very familiar with it, but could still understand the basic points that I'm bringing up. And the two conclusions that I've drawn in having studied this subject for 17 years. One is that UFOs are a physical object that exists. And two, they are intelligently controlled. And all indications are whatever controls them is much more advanced than we are.
Well, I would say they're much more advanced than we are based on the observed performances of them and very little else. So
Right.
That kind of gives that away. I was most interested in the chapter on electromagnetic effects. I've done a lot of study of that. I know you cited Mark Roddiker's work on car stalling, but there's other aspects of electromagnetic effects. What disappointed me there was you, A, didn't call me about the Levelland case, and B, I think, I know from studying that case in depth that the sheriff said there were literally hundreds of witnesses to the UFO. Not all of them had their cars stalled and that sort of thing, but it was an interesting thing that took place over 2 or 3 hours near Levelland, Texas. And for those of you who are not familiar with Texas, that would be near Lubbock. And even if you live in Texas, you may not know where it is. But it was a long, involved process. There was a sighting up in, not Austin, Amarillo, hours before things happened in Level Land, where the close approach of the UFO actually burned out the car's battery. And I didn't see that mentioned in the book. But what do you make of the whole electromagnetic effect part of the UFO phenomenon?
Well, I think the Leveline case is actually one of the best cases. I didn't go into the detail you're referring to, or that, there was also cases in New Mexico that happened within 24 hours of that. There was just a huge number of cases, because I wrote the book more for the average American who would want to know that Leveline occurred, but probably not the detail that I could have gone into, because you could write probably 100 pages just on Leveland if you really wanted to get into that case. But
yes, I did a whole book on it, so
yeah.
I'm aware of that.
I would recommend anyone who really likes the Leveland case to read your book on it, and that's true of a lot of the cases I touched on. There's a lot more information than what I put in the book.
Well, I had noticed that there were just snippets of information, gave you kind of the basics, and I guess you sort of expected if the reader was interested, they would search out additional information on their own.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly correct. And so in terms of the electromagnetic, my view on that is that it's most likely, there's no way to know for sure, but it's most likely a byproduct of whatever propulsion mechanisms that these UFOs utilize. That would be my best guess.
Well, I kind of came to that conclusion as well, but the electromagnetic effects is a very small subset of the whole overall UFO phenomena, which would suggest that there are other means of propulsion, and not all the UFOs exhibited these electromagnetic effects.
That's correct. They don't all. For example, triangles. I'm not aware of very many cases at all where a triangle has created an electromagnetic effect. Have you heard of any?
I was trying to think. The earliest case I remember talking about electromagnetic effect was in 1909, and a guy was riding his motorcycle in England, and there was an object in the field near the road, and his motorcycle sort of stalled at that point. Once it was gone, he had no trouble getting his motorcycle started again. But that's the earliest one I know of. And of course, there was the French wave from 1954 when they had an awful lot of electromagnetic effects. I guess I should say France and South America.
Yeah.
But that also involved the paralysis of some of the witnesses, that the object flashed a beam or did something, and the witness was paralyzed for a period of time.
Well, this is not related to the book, but a study that we completed within the last year. We took 301 of what we considered the best cases based on some particular definitions. And of course, the disc is the most common, which you would have known that without doing this study we did. And the triangle was the second most common. But what was unique that we found is that of the triangle cases that we looked at, none of those ever exhibited an EMI effect, which the discs are the ones that most commonly do that.
Well, and egg-shaped objects, I think, as well, are
right.
kind of responsible for that. But the thing that intrigues me is this is the craft interacting with the environment, and there would be ways to investigate that after the fact. I think the Condon Committee suggested a magnetic mapping of the vehicles and see how the the magnetic field of the metal in the cars might have been affected by the close approach of the UFO, and that would require them, of course, to find other cars that were manufactured at the same plant about the same time to see if the magnetic readings on the car differed significantly from those other cars made at the same time, which seems to be a very Herculean task to do unless everybody's out there magnetically mapping their car so they can check it if a UFO approaches.
There was actually a case about 15 years ago in New York that was attempted, but it didn't happen, unfortunately.
The other thing that I've heard about, the other electromagnetic effect, and it's like 4 cases I know of where the car changed colors, the paint changed colors after the close approach of the UFO. And in one case, the guy drove home after the sighting, and his wife wanted to know if he'd bought a new car because it was a different color. Did you find or read about any of those, or that probably wouldn't have made your list of the 300 cases?
Yeah, I'm not aware of those, but I would think if something like that happened, it would almost seem like there was some heat involved to do something like that.
Well, I was going to say they're probably older cars, so the paint didn't have any magnetic properties of their own that would cause it to change. So, and there's like 4 cases that I'm aware of, so it's not that big a deal. You talked to pilots. Were they? Well, I guess the question I should have been asking, and I didn't write it down, but the question I should have been asking, you said there were 300 cases that you picked out that you found significant. What were the criterion for deciding on those cases?
So that's a good question. So the criteria we looked at, one was that we had either multiple witnesses or a very good single witness, right, such as a military pilot or a policeman. The second criteria was that the object was within a close enough distance that its size, as you looked at it, was at least about a third of the size of the full moon. And we use that because that allows you to pick up detail of an object. So the object had to be close enough that you could get detail. That was the second criteria. Third criteria was it either had to occur during the day, or if it was at night, there had to be some illumination, whether it's self-illumination or illumination from street lights, etc. And let's see, there was a fourth criteria. I don't recall what it was at the moment, but those were the key criteria. And the criteria that eliminated most cases was that the object was close enough that its angular size in the sky was at least 0.15 degrees, which is roughly a third the size of the full moon.
I was in looking at the cases, and I'm going to go back to Levelland for just a moment, because what I noticed about that case that isn't obvious to people is Sheriff, and I hate his name, Sheriff Clem of Hockley County, Weir Clem, what a name, reported on the day after the sightings, which I think was a Sunday, that he had gotten close enough to the object to see a shape. We called it a football shape or an oval-shaped object. Right. The Air Force investigated on the following Tuesday. They sent a mid-level NCO who spent almost an entire 7 hours investigating the case. Weir's Clem's statement to the Air Force chain that he just saw a streak of red for about 2 seconds in the distance. And then later on, Don Berliner, and I'm sure you know who Don Berliner is, interviewed the sheriff in 1975, and he was back to the oval-shaped object. And what I discovered is another Don Berlinson, was investigating the case. He found the mechanic for the sheriff's department from that time, and he interviewed him and said the next day, which would have been the Sunday, the sheriff brought his car in to have it checked out, which means his car stalled, and it was wanting to find out if there was a mechanical reason for doing that. But interestingly, behind him was a car with state police in it, and behind that car was a car with Air Force officers in it. So there were Air Force officers close enough to have their car stalled. I have not been able to find the Air Force officers, unfortunately. But I thought you might find that a little bit interesting.
Well, yeah, no, that was definitely interesting. And Levelland is one of the 301 cases we identified. That was one of the ones.
Well, I was going to say, I kind of met, they saw the object close enough. It was in sight for long enough. It approached the ground. There's evidence that there was landing traces found. So, I mean, it's a very good case. Oh, yes, literally dozens of them.
Yeah.
So I found that very interesting as well. I know I've diverted the conversation from your book to my fascination with Levelland, which is probably not fair to you. When we come back in just a moment, we'll dig into some of the other aspects of the book, things that you found. I know you talk about the vast distances and relativistic speeds and getting to other solar systems and that sort of thing, which I found fascinating only because it sort of fits into the realm of science fiction, where we are today, at least, and that sort of thing. And other aspects that you might find important in the book that I kind of missed out on, and give a good reading of that book. Once again, the website for me is kevinrandle.blogspot.com. If there's a sighting that you're interested in, there's a search engine there. It tells you if I've done anything on that particular sighting, and it'll link right to it, so you don't have to search around for it. There's like 1,400 articles posted there at this time, so it's I think of it as a good resource anyway. We will be back right after this, so please stick around. I'm here with Robert Powell. His book is A Scientist Explains What We Know and Don't Know. It's about UFOs, and that's where we start. I noticed you started the beginning of the modern UFO era. Most people in the UFO community started on June 24th, 1947, when Kenneth Arnold made his sighting, or it was reported. You begin it back in World War II. Tell me a little bit about that.
So, yeah, the way I look at it, Kevin, is I took all the data from Project Blue Book, MUFON, NICAP, all the basic sources, and I pulled sources from the early 20th century, and then I plotted, number of reports on the y-axis versus the year, right? And so basically, you see noise until you get to the year 1942, which is when what's called the Foo Fighters were first reported, and that's when I see the first significant uptick. So, to me, the modern phenomenon began in 1942 during the Second World War.
Did you discount the great airship sightings from 1897?
That's the one exception, right? Is those the blimps from the 1890s, and so that one is not clear to me whether or not those are what I consider true UFOs or not. So if you go clear back into the 1800s, right, you see that one blimp during those few years, and then it basically is noise going all the way across until you get to 1942. So if those were true UFOs, then for approximately 45 years, there was nothing to speak of.
So you start with the Foo Fighters, and those were objects seen by Allied, all the airmen during World War II. There were sightings on the ground. Most of them were, I guess, glowing balls of fire or orbs or things like that, but a few of them were disc-shaped objects.
Right.
Did you look at those reports carefully and separate the blobs of fire from the discs and that, like that?
Right. There were reports of disc-shaped objects. So the Foo Fighters weren't just blobs of plasma that occurred. But for the purposes,
and I'm sure you looked at Keith Chester's book.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite
books.
Go ahead. Keith Chester's book is I consider one of the best books on the Foo Fighters. It's a good read for anyone.
Then we move to 1947, that era. There were sightings going on prior to Kenneth Arnold that didn't get a lot of publicity until after his sighting. Were you able to distinguish anything there that was very exciting that might have triggered it had they got the press interested in it?
There was, one or two or three sightings in the continental U.S. before Kenneth Arnold, but they weren't reported till after the Kenneth Arnold sighting. So it's always hard to say, okay, was that a reaction to his sighting, or did they truly are unique sightings that happened before Kenneth Arnold? But I think Kenneth Arnold is probably the beginning of sightings in the continental United States. But the Foo Fighters are the beginning of the sightings if you look at the whole world. And many people don't realize that, you and I do, but amazingly, not everyone realizes that UFOs are not unique to the United States.
Well, there were the ghost rockets from Sweden, of course, in 1946, and some of the other sightings in other parts of the world, especially Northern Europe. and there were sightings going on in South America at the same time. So I find that all very interesting as well.
Yeah, those in the 1954 sightings, right, in France, in Italy, there were they had a large flap of sightings that did not occur in the United States, that were unique kind of to Europe. And, that always makes you wonder why the flap in Europe, that was unique. But that's probably one of the most interesting sightings during the European eras.
Well, following in that vein, one thing that I found kind of exciting was you're looking at the sightings from 1947, an awful lot of them in New Mexico. And the question is why? Well, the first atomic bomb was dropped on New Mexico. And then after the war ended, an awful lot of rocket research was going on in New Mexico. And if you're an alien race visiting Earth, two things that are probably going to frighten you is atomic energy and the ability of us to get off of the Earth. So I think that kind of explains why there would have been a focus in the desert Southwest at that time. You mentioned in the book, you talk about change in attitudes. I know that for the longest time it was if you saw a UFO, you were probably drunk or you weren't too bright or you were deluded in some fashion. But you talk about a change in attitude. What kind of sparked that change in attitude, do you think?
So I think there were two basic things that changed the attitude, right? One was more gradual, and that was the discovery of exoplanets. Prior to 1992, we did not even have an idea that another planet existed beyond those in our solar system. And after 1992, the number, and I have a chart of this in my book, but the number of exoplanets discovered has just gone up exponentially. So today, it's close to 6,000 exoplanets that have been discovered. So that makes people realize that the Earth is not as unique as they thought. So that was one thing that happened. The second thing was more specific in time, and that was the December 16th, 2017 article in the New York Times, which was related to the USS Nimitz, USS Princeton, and two F-18s that encountered a tic-tac shaped object in the Pacific, off the Pacific coast of the United States, about 70 miles southwest of San Diego. And the testimonies of those Navy pilots, I think, was very strong and really influenced a lot of people.
Wasn't there a real push, especially in the 1950s, to kind of ridicule the whole thing from the government, talking about, well, you don't believe in those flying saucers, do you? Especially after the Washington Nationals in 1952, where they were seen on radar, they were seen by military pilots, civilian pilots. They attempted to intercept it. I talked to two of the people who were there at the time, Dewey Fournay and Al Chop, and they were in the radar room and said, well, these clearly were not weather-related phenomenon. But that didn't seem to get much of a play. I guess it didn't change attitudes too much, except the government worked very hard after that, especially in January of 1953, to ridicule the whole idea of flying saucers.
Right. And the Air Force and the CIA put together the Robertson panel. And that was one of their recommendations, was to debunk the whole idea of flying saucers to the American public.
And wasn't that sort of the purpose of the Condon Committee as well, the University of Colorado study that was sponsored by the Air Force in the late 60s?
Yeah, the Condon Committee, and my take on that, Kevin, is I think the Condon Committee started with the marsh gases up in Michigan. When Hynek went up there and the Air Force went to debunk that and came up, Hynek called DC, trying to think, okay, what could this be? And someone mentioned, well, it could be marsh gas, which is methane gas that comes out of the marshes and can sometimes spontaneously combust. So when he floated that, it really insulted the local populace, because there were dozens of people, again, who had seen these objects, and they knew that it wasn't marsh gas. So the problem the Air Force had was there happened to be a representative up in Michigan by the name of Gerald Ford. And of course, being a good politician, he went to bat for his constituents. And so he called the Air Force before Congress and asked for an investigation. So that investigation they were able to quelch, but it could have very easily not been quelched. And so I think that's because that was in roughly the year 1966 and 67. So I think the Air Force saw the headache that UFOs were causing them. And they said, okay, let's get out of this business. And that's when they went looking for universities to investigate and basically come up with the conclusion that there's no national security issue. The Air Force doesn't need to investigate UFOs. And they actually had to go through a lot of universities before they got to the University of Colorado. So they basically called in their favors, and Condon, who had worked for the Air Force before, was able to get the University of Colorado to agree to do this study on UFOs. And anyone who reads the study that the University of Colorado Condon Committee put out, it's like 900 pages. And Condon's summary up in the front says, one, this is not a threat to national security, and two, there's no scientific value in studying this anymore. But if you look in the inside and look what some of the various scientists wrote, some of them wrote, some of these cases we have no explanation for, and they felt that there should have been study continuing on the subject itself.
Well, my favorite explanation for one of the sightings they allegedly studied was it was a natural phenomenon so rare it had never been seen before or since. And I'm thinking at that point, you've discovered some new natural phenomenon. Maybe that does deserve additional scientific study. But all of that is sort of negated by the latest material coming out of the Congress and NASA and the various agencies appointed to study that in the last couple of years, where they're saying, yes, there is a national security implication. Yes, there is something to be learned by further study.
Yeah, and actually, I think the military or the government have got themselves in a bigger hole by admitting there's a national security issue, right? And they're doing that because of the drones that exist today, right, which are a national security issue. But by tying the UFO question with drones, now it's more difficult for them to get out of it, right? Because they have now admitted there's a national security issue, so you can't just toss it away. Well, in the 50s, they were actually smarter by saying, oh, there's no national security issue. Don't worry about it. Don't look at it. We toss it aside. So I think
we're going to have to take another break. Don't mean to interrupt you. We're going to have to take another break. When we come back, you talk about in the conclusions of the book, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which I now like to think of as the off-world hypothesis, because it's a neater term that comes out of Blade Runner, for those of you who are science fiction fans. And once again, there's an awful lot of information in Robert's book that is very good and very, I guess, current, the way things are going. We will be back right after this, and we'll finish up with Robert Powell at that point. So please stick around. And we are back with Robert Powell. We're talking about his book, UFOs, A Scientist Explains What We Know and Don't Know About UFOs, obviously. In the conclusions of the book, you talk about the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Are you a fan of that? Or do you think there's maybe many more terrestrial explanations that will eliminate the visitation aspect?
Yeah, and I think it's important, Kevin, that your audience understand the extraterrestrial hypothesis is only that. It's a hypothesis. It's the one I favor, but that doesn't mean it is the answer, right? And with a hypothesis, a scientist is always willing to discard the hypothesis if you have information that you feel strengthens a different hypothesis. But in the extraterrestrial hypothesis, I think the key thing there is the question of interstellar travel, right? Most scientists will agree today that there's likely intelligent life out in the universe, right? The question becomes, it can't get here because light is a barrier in terms of speed to be able to come down here. But things have changed in the last 20 years. There's a project called the Breakthrough Project, for example. And the goal is by the year 2069, so that's 45 years from now, to be able to send a spacecraft to Alpha Centauri at 20% of the speed of light. Now, Alpha Centauri is the nearest star and planetary system to the Earth. It's 4 light years away, which if you're traveling at 20% of the speed of light, that means in 20 years, your spacecraft will get there. Well, the Voyager's already been traveling more than 20 years. So 20 years is not too long a period of time if you're in terms of getting information back. And the way this works is the spacecraft is actually a tiny computer chip. So there's almost no mass, and that's the key. There's very little mass to the spacecraft, and they connect it to solar sails. And then they hit the solar sails with these powerful lasers, right? And the laser beams, of course, are moving at the speed of light. And the more you can minimize the mass, the more you can impart that speed to the object that's connected to the sail. So all the estimates are that they could send a very small craft to Alpha Centauri in basically 20 years. So that's us today, or us in the near future. A civilization several hundred years more advanced than us could probably send something close to the speed of light to our solar system.
Well, I'm thinking of one of the problems is you're talking about a small craft as opposed to something that would carry living beings.
Right.
And do you favor the idea that this civilization has been able to send craft with living beings to the Earth to, I guess, study what we're doing here?
Well, I don't know if they're living beings or if they're, robotic systems, that I don't know. But the craft appear to be in size, on average, around 30 to 50 feet in size. So that's much larger than anything we could send out into interstellar space. But a civilization much more advanced than us may have figured out how to do that. And the thing is, as you approach the speed of light, time slows down for the occupants of the craft as compared to our time. So that means you could go to a star system 100 light years away. And while for you and I, it's going to take light 100 years to get to that star system, if we were traveling in a craft and you and I were inside that craft moving at 99% of the speed of light, the amount of time that passed might only be a few weeks or a few days, depending on how close you are to the speed of light, because at the speed of light, time stops. And as you move away from it, time slowly begins to speed up again.
Well, the only problem I see with that, which is the basis of a number of good science fiction stories, is they've launched a probe going close to the speed of light to some star system. And when they return, civilization is completely different because literally hundreds of years have gone by and these guys have been gone 4 or 5 weeks or maybe 4 or 5 months. So they do have to integrate back into the society. There was another great story where they had launched probes that would take moving not quite at the speed of light, much slower than the speed of light. But when they arrive at their destination, the humans are already there because they've now cracked the system and they can get across space a lot faster, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's another, Kevin Knuth came up with an interesting story on that also, which is kind of a science fiction, which is imagine a nomadic civilization, right? And they don't even live anymore on their world. And so what they do is they traverse the entire galaxy and they say, okay, in 6 months, we'll meet you over at this point, right? So meanwhile, they just travel all over the place, right? And time is slowed for them. But 6 months of their time later, they all meet together at different points and communicate, talk, then go off onto their next journey.
Well, you also talked about us sending a very small probe to Alpha Centauri. I'm sure you've talked to Avi Loeb about some of this.
I haven't talked to Avi personally, but I think Avi is on that project. It's called the Breakthrough Project, and NASA's even signed up to be part of it.
Well, he's got the Galileo project, which I
Right.
guess involves searching for other objects. He suggested there was a object that passed through the solar system several years ago that had been traveling for literally hundreds of thousands of years, and kind of postulating the civilization was sending these things out, saying, "Here we are," but there was no biological or um, entities aboard the craft, and I just thought that was kind of an interesting proposition.
Yeah, I don't, whether or not Avi's right about that or not, I don't know. Um, but it's possible, right? But my understanding of what he's proposing is it's not necessarily a craft that had a purpose, right? It could have been interstellar garbage that was just moving from one across, interstellar space and went through ours. What he knows for certain is that the object did not come from our solar system. It came from outside our solar system.
Which is unique by itself.
Right.
It's the only time we know of an object that came from outside the solar system and traversed it, whether it was natural or some kind of an artificial craft. I did want to say one thing about the timing here, and I've lost it, proving that my brain is slowly melting, which is a horrible thing to have happen. Oh yes. The probe that we have sent out that has now left the solar system so many long years ago is traveling nowhere near the speed of light. So I want people to understand this is not part of the idea. It's going at 20% of the speed of light and get there in 20 years. It's maybe 80,000 years before it gets anywhere.
You're absolutely right. Voyager is moving at, something like 40,000 miles an hour or less. It will take tens of thousands of years to get anywhere.
Yeah, I just wanted to make that clear for the audience in case they misunderstood exactly what we were talking about there. Well, when was there anything you found in the book when you were writing the book? Anything that you found that really surprised you?
That surprised me. Not really, because I'm writing about what my experience and what I've learned from. I've probably interviewed hundreds of people in person, and I've read like yourself, I've read thousands of UFO reports. So I really was trying to convey to the individual who has not studied the UFO subject why it's important, and some basic information that will allow them to perhaps get curious enough to study more about the subject.
Well, I know in my research, I sometimes stumble on nuggets, and one of those would be, again, going back to Levelland, that there were Air Force officers following the sheriff when he went out and saw the object. That I'd never seen that reported before.
Oh, yeah. Okay, Kevin. Yeah, there's a nugget I was aware of that I put in the book, and that is that you're familiar, right, with the gimbal and the go fast videos.
Yes.
So I talked to a military officer and he convinced me there are 3 other videos besides those 2 that exist. And in one of those videos, there is an object on video approaching the F-18, like a collision is about to happen. And then the guy in the F-18 happens to lock his dummy missile to his radar. And it's as if the object detected that. And of course, maybe it doesn't know if it's a dummy missile. And the object immediately just makes a right hand turn and just zips off the screen. But the reason I know that those videos exist is because the officer told me about Go Fast before Go Fast was ever released. So I knew that he had seen the videos.
There's one of those surprising nuggets that we look for when we're doing our research. You have to go through an awful lot of material to get to that point.
Oh yeah, you're right.
I spent hours and hours and hours in archives going through files looking for that little nugget. And like I said, one of the nuggets I found was that there were probably Air Force officers whose cars were stalled in the Levelland sightings. We're out of time here. I hate to say that, but we're out of time here. The book is UFOs, A Scientist Explains What We Know and Don't Know. Robert, I thank you for your time. I appreciate the conversation. I hope it wasn't too boring for you.
No, I enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, Kevin. It was good talking to you again.
Yeah, it's always good talking with you as well. And I'll be in communication about some other things in the near future.
All right,
So
sounds good.
You have a good day. Thank you so much.
Thanks. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye. So anyway, that wraps it up for this show, more or less. I will be back next week. I will be talking to Stephen Bassett about a number of things, including the disclosure projects and how things are escalating in that arena, I suppose. For those of you who don't know, I also write books, and I've been accused of falsifying UFO reports because I write fiction books. The Vietnam Ground Zero series, which has just been re-released. You can take a look at those books, loosely based on some of my activities or experiences in Vietnam. Some of it is just observations and working with people like that. Done a number of UFO books. The latest on Roswell is Understanding Roswell, that delves in a strange way, I suppose, into the people who were involved there, the critical people on that object. And also Roswell in the 21st Century, what looks at a little bit about that. And the latest UFO book that came out is 1973, which deals with the sightings from that time. And it was inspired by Calvin Parker, who has been on the show a couple of times. I will be back next week, as I say, with Stephen Bassett. So I'll see you then. Thank you for tuning in.